Hello everyone, today we talk about late Italian communal warfare and more in particular of that specific period between the Angevin victories at Benevent at Tagliacozzo and the arrival of Henry VII in the peninsula. Actually, we'll stop to 1300 roughly. We're not looking at dates in great specifics here, but looking at this phase of Angevin peace, Pax Andegavensis, so to say, it's actually a term that I coined myself for this phase of actual Guelph, broadly speaking, Guelph hegemony over not just southern, after the conquest of the Kingdom of Sicily by Charles of Anjou, but also central and northern Italy, the Italy of the communes, of the city-states by this point, that indeed after the fall of the Swabians was really mostly ruled by Guelph regimes in the various cities, with the specific, of course, connection with the Kingdom of Sicily, Naples in between after the Vespers, because as you know, the Angevins essentially lose Sicily after in fact that insurrection backed by the Aragonese, the Byzantines, and so on. This phase is particularly important in the medieval art, in the development of the medieval art of war in general, not just for the Italian communes. Regarding which, I think at some point I shall make a video uniquely stressing the incredibly ignored, but especially underrated, not just military, but broadly speaking, political, social, yes, but for people who are fixated in general with pop culture revolving about massive armies, battles, etc., time properly the entire medieval warfare. I shall be more specific because the more I make videos on the Middle Ages, I realize that largely it's difficult. I'm sorry to say it. It's not a criticism, if not in a broader sense, towards what is indeed the reflection of what I know, just from academic background and the general, say, pseudo-historical landscape that unfortunately our culture has fallen into. That the, as I always say, diachronic and comparative understanding of civilizational development, of political and military history is absent, and it is incredibly absent even more for medieval Europe in general. There are many ways people approach the Middle Ages. The most common is, okay, there is a country that I come from, and I have to essentially fixate exclusively on this, pretending that this time that I see as the Middle Ages, overloaded with strange sort of bias and with positive or negative fashion, somehow reflects an era of, regional quality of my people, and by reflection myself, even though I'm a complete failure and I do not know absolutely anything about any remote trace of the history of my own country, let alone the one of other countries, including the ones that made your history during the Middle Ages. And one of the greatest problems of this is that you can't really make it understand to people unless you exercise violence. Sometimes, I mean, this was legally mandated, even just through a normally qualitative education. Probably we could fix the issue, but it's a greater problem, right? The second one, however, that is perhaps also worse than this, is that historiographically, as you know, we are sinking into some sort of hyper-specialization, compartmentalization that doesn't make even the scholar that you normally maybe even follow on Academia Ide on Facebook or wherever that publishes, oh my god, this person has an academic background, published that, actually studies war because, oh my god, this is an expert in medieval warfare, he's the cool kind of historian, he knows the deal. actually knows any better, right? Of course, he does know better what history is, how to study that. Of course, there are sort of pretty bad curricula and backgrounds. Most military historians are simply polymologists, right? They're not specializing in any aspect of the art of war. They don't actually even care about that. They don't live off of that. I happen to have a certain background, to know certain specific things. It's not like I am, I don't know, an expert on other aspects of medieval history other than warfare. I don't specialize, say, I don't know, in economic history or history of art, right? I know something about that because I have a broader background. It sort of works on YouTube. Every time I make a video about socioeconomical history, everybody flocks on it, even though it's not that what I'm saying is wrong, right? But it's just the basics that you can't find in any medieval history manual. And that's when you realize that people do not really know literally anything about what we do, and that we are also largely not interested in educating people in a broader sense. As you know, I make Schwerpunkt in parallel to that professional activity, and of course I do not speak on Schwerpunkt the way I publish articles, because first of all, it would take forever to make a video, and this doesn't mean you can't actually make some positive content on YouTube, also in a qualitative sense, and actually doing it more than the average is extremely easy. As you understand, I don't know any channel on YouTube that actually makes anything that's some sort of cheaply and superficially researched mash of something and selling it in a sort of 10-20 minutes fashion, dispatching it for some sort of higher academic quality. That may be still correct content to some degree, but the presumption that by listening to it makes you actually understand anything about what that historically means is really painful to even conceive. One of the, if not the, when we speak about the art of war specifically, single most underrated chapters whatsoever in this picture is late Italian communal warfare. There are extremely few people studying it. There are extremely few people being actually competent about the art of war and even know whether they exist, really. And the reasons stemming from what? We think, well, maybe nobody studies it because it's a secondary topic, right? I have people make, as you know, a lot of Italian communal history content. And every once in a while I get this feedback, which I don't get almost from any kind of topic, that is, oh my god, I thought that this topic was so secondary, so niche. There is all this stuff to know. Well, yeah, because it's taken individually a disproportionately major chapter in the entire medieval history. Like, it's not 1/20th, it's not 1/10th. It's just, it revolves around 1/4, 1/3. Right? It's a huge deal. It's something you can't simply say, okay, well, I don't know that, so I know medieval history. Naturally, this taking into consideration the whole Italian communal civilization, that also, for this reason, I don't think most people really understand to begin with. I have some of you asking me, but so were the communes something like an anarchic thing? Or, oh my god, these were the enemies of the empire that were bad because these were the merchants, right? That, were like the secular Zamar. I have this kind of feedback, right? And being a person who specializes specifically in the Holy Roman Empire of this period, and I study Italian and German warfare pretty in depth, I feel like physical pain when I hear this, because I understand perfectly why people don't know about this topic. There are tons of reasons, starting from, again, complete lack in just basic history in general. medieval history even more, Italian history even more, because, I don't know, it's as if Italy was not important. Secondly, knowing maybe vernacular, maybe studying the history of 30 city-states altogether to make sense of what is happening. Not even Italians really studied this. This is interesting, because you would expect that, and that, this is maybe an exception, right? Not really. If you really study, if you pick individual national histories during medieval times and their military history specifically, you will find tons, of course, of articles, of studies on this or that topic, but say a simply comprehensive study of, say, what was the general military landscape of a region in, 50, 60 years, and especially during, like at this point, the peak of medieval civilization, you will find nothing. They just don't do that, right? They never did it in the past. I should also make a bit to explain how, let's say, the experts in the experts in military history were, say, starting from the Brook, the end of the 19th century, etc., and explaining why along the way, not just this were always somehow rare, and especially in that sense, study not just medieval warfare, but the art of war. So how actually armies deploy, move, fight, not just, let's read an account about this guy telling us what hand-to-hand combat was. No, that's something that reenactors fixate with. The individualistic, sort of alienated monad that, without any context, without any, also massively structured and systemic evidence that we fortunately have for this topic. For example, just to point out how this chapter is important, late communal Italy is disproportionately the single best documented time in medieval warfare. There is simply nothing else that can come, not even the post phase of this, specifically as far as combat battles are concerned. The historiographic production is shockingly advanced. Like, if you compare it to what we're doing in Flanders, it was also a pretty affluent place, etc. We're just easily 100 years ahead in terms of historiographical development. We have some of the single most important figures, not just politically or militarily, stemming from this period. Think about Dante. That alone tells you that there is something deeply wrong about this popular lack of awareness about this topic. There are lots of other reasons, also stemming from the fact that, of course, continental Europeans didn't study the history of war with at least great enthusiasm or at least great motivation after the Second World War, especially after the 60s and the 70s, when sort of the communists hijacked a great part, fortunately not all of it, not completely. Some of them were even capable, at least not the communists maybe in particular, but say I also come from that, say from a university where still the same kids of 1968 were my professors, right? And for example, my tutor is a liberal. We never really talked much about politics, etc., but she's an excellent historian. She's one of the greatest experts in a particular branch of history, and she taught me a lot, and I can't say, well, okay, that's bad. Unfortunately, what happens in the Anglosphere is much more radical. It is, right? It's severe, except part of the problem why we're talking this, that, say, a topic like late Italian communal warfare is not discussed, is in part also the snobbery of, okay, but who the hell cares about continental European culture or history to begin with? There is just, Oxford and Cambridge, right? We are actually the collectors of classical historical legacy. Already the Middle Ages in general do not really seem to us but something strangely weird that we have to mock rather than to take seriously. Let's not even discuss the imperial Catholic tradition, because that, it's like indeed throwing holy water on a possessed. Literally in this case, considering the confessional background, little joke, you will allow me. So you think that we know the medieval art of war. That in 2024, like if you want to have a sort of solid, bulky grasp of what the entire picture of medieval warfare is, like we have it, we don't. We don't. There are not scholars that I'm aware of today, not even people that I think have not really made a great job. Like De Vries, for example. I liked De Vries at the beginning, then I also used him for I inspired myself partly in his PhD thesis methodologically for my own that went by far ahead and made me realize, in fact, how even such popular figures, again, the guy that is cool because he talks about medieval warfare and so it becomes a meme, right? You think, does he actually know that much? He quantitatively, yes, right? But formally speaking, like giving a solid dimension to even sometimes a tactical analysis that he wrote a PhD thesis on, no. But more importantly, this sense of how big were, armies in medieval times and realizing the differences from country to country, period to period. You don't find such things. You have these cliches like, medieval armies were little. So make a list of the tens of thousands actually, of citations that we can find from the sources of Italian armies between, say, 1290 and 1340, and tell me how many times, for all the battles, and including, in fact, such large amount of armies, and that are documented by several tens of sources, you find armies that are actually 30,000 men. You find weird lists on YouTube, on the internet, the sense, look at how small armies really were. The English had Cressy were just 15,000, so all the rest of Europe, like, we don't even count that, right? We're talking systematically expeditions of multiple tens of thousands of men, battles with 30,000 men from one side, 20,000 from the other. And you'd say, but I've never heard of them. Yes, you know why you have never heard of them? Pick the Oxford Encyclopedia of Medieval Warfare and search for which kind of battles were listed. Now you have, for obvious cultural reasons, the Battle of Campaldino, for example, 1289, Dante in the Feditore of the Florentine army. Everybody knows about the battle, the comedy, and so on. You find Montaperti, massive bloodshed. Actually, we talked about that a couple of months ago. Okay, so how many troops were there in these armies? Well, yes, it were 20,000, 30,000 actually at Montaperti from the Florentine side. Campaldino was slightly smaller. So not a big deal, right? Or maybe those sources are inflated. No, they are not inflated. The sources are pretty clear about the figures. And if you, again, come from a background where the entire sort of prototype of medieval literature, historiography is, Courtier writing later medieval history, one source, one number or just a gross exaggeration just for the sake of it, in a famous chronicler, that's not what even, for example, and specifically in this case, the highly civilized Italian communal historiography is actually about. Because, again, I realized from my experience on YouTube out there that political and social awareness, that cultural, literary background that it is needed to understand this place is not there. It's not provided by any educational system that I'm aware of. On the it's the Oxford, yes, Encyclopedia of Medieval Warfare, you found this battle, but you do not find the Battle of Montecatini, which is pretty much the biggest one of the era. We're talking 30,000 men from the Guelph Angevin side, 20,000 men from the Pisan Lucchese side. This is a much bigger, more important battle. By any indicator, political, military, social, it's the largest, the most important, the one that changed the greater balance strategically. It's not present in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Medieval Warfare. They don't even know what it is. And why? Because it's not like that the people that write these things have bothered themselves to actually think that there is a comprehensive way to scan medieval warfare at large, and missing one of the single largest battles in the medieval millennium, one of capital centrality in the entire Mediterranean balance, and notoriously recognized by these specific studies that do exist on this. No. You will essentially focus on the battle that is more historiographically, by contemporary indicators, I don't know which one they use, discussed. It's true that before Chisavetta and Grillo there weren't adequate even reviews, insight on Montecatini, but I think the Oxford is later than Chisavetta. In any case, it's also a very famous battle. I mean, it's not like I don't know how they chose the list in the Oxford Encyclopedia, but of medieval warfare. Bear in mind, but this is not battle for connoisseur that nobody knows and that had never heard. This is just like, I don't know. It's the Battle of Nájera in the Iberian theater of the. They're not just the clashes between the Castilians, also of the 100 Years' War. This is a central battle that everybody knows, that is widely documented by the same sources that you use, notoriously major sources for the same battle of Crécy or Courtrai, that is Villani, that you've heard many times. That was just into the thing. Again, it's by far the largest battle in Tuscany. Possibly of the entire medieval, surely I think the entire medieval history. Such larger numbers were never reached again. It was also a big deal because some certain members of the Angevin Neapolitan house were killed in the battle. It's a masterpiece in tactic. It's the single most tactically complex and complete medieval battle that I know, and I shall make a video about it also to explain you how it is. And I would be the only one making it on YouTube because nobody actually even knows what it is. I'm actually going to search now because I'm sure no one of the bigger channels did. If somebody did it, somebody from either from Italy with a sort of an amatorial sketch that made it, because it's extremely famous as a matter of fact, and extremely important, so that you can't really miss it. But since nobody made a big publishing, nobody wrote an Osprey on to copy from, nobody bothered themselves. There is not. Oh my god. No, yes, there is one. This is an Italian title. Yes, there are actually two, but they are, 20 minutes, one from 7 years ago, and 5 minutes from, this is more just like a little documentary. And I think this is literally all it exists on YouTube, on the Battle of Montecatini. Search how many smaller battles of the Middle Ages, some of which passed for a big deal, that actually aren't in comparison to this, and how much subcultural distortion of historical objectivity and reality exists in people that presume even to claim to be passionate about medieval warfare. This is the little, introduction / ramble to the issue, because we must first of all proclaim that we live in a world that lacks the ABC of Western identity, culture, history, and this cannot go on like this. There is no comparative study between countries. There is no internal dialogue. This is just a sick way, in part. Actually, a still very good academia in continental Europe works, but still focusing on a bit like everybody is entrenching now. There are no money anymore, so entrenching in one owns ivory tower, cultivating one owns little garden, and that's basically it. You have to partially understand that this always happens in times of crisis. But it's not like we lack the means. If I can talk about this on the internet with tens of thousands of followers, I think that many other people can, and they don't. All right. So today we focus actually on this phase, again, mostly of Guelph Angevin hegemony. It's one of great relevance for a couple of reasons. As we'll see now, there is this broader Angevin, Provençal, Neapolitan, partially also broadly French protection on central northern Italy, at least the Guelph regimes of the region. There are still Ghibelline cities and other centers of power that resist, but broadly, at this point, the empire is below ground in terms of German power, and it's not really until Rudolf of Habsburg and the moment in which the papacy itself realizes that, after all, calling the Angevins wasn't even that better idea, that keeping to deal with the Swabians, at least for the specific contingencies of Rome, of which, for example, Charles of Anjou was senator at some point, really changed the situation. I'm preparing, by the way, a video about the Battle of Tallia. So this is really incidental because this video I'm making now is from the cycle. I had just chosen a special about Tagliacozzo, so we will see at least that side of the story. You know how things went, right? Charles of Anjou arrives in Italy in 1266, and he crushes Manfred of Swabia, the natural son, and essentially was actually the usurper of the Kingdom of Sicily at that point towards his nephew, Conradin. But he was a capable ruler. He, however, dies in battle. The story of the crusade against Manfred, it's incredibly messy. We talked a little bit about southern Italian power at this point, like especially the Neapolitan establishment is an incredibly big but also messy and unfortunately not so well documented reality, at least as the center and the north of the peninsula, about which we know, again, disproportionately more than any other period insofar in medieval history from the previous centuries and regions. And this first victory, first of all, had revitalized the Guelph faction throughout the peninsula, significantly shifting the existing balance of power. We were talking recently, I don't remember in which video, but we also did so it doesn't matter so much. In the battle about Montaperti, of course, 1266 brings to... yes, we were talking about it in the video about Florence sometime, but it was still... didn't make the 13th century. And maybe I'm confusing myself with a script that I wrote for the next chapter. In fact, the Florentine history. But you know what's the story? The city had been Ghibelline since 1260 because the Guelphs had been massacred at Montaperti. And now, when Manfred had similarly sponsored to what the Angevins will do later, respectively the Ghibellines and the Guelphs, in the rest of Italy, the city comes back to the Guelph hegemony, even without much effort in major climatic battle whatsoever. This state of affairs is, of course, consolidated after 1268, when Charles of Anjou defeated Conradin of Swabia at the Battle of Tagliacozzo. The young Hohenstaufen, the last Hohenstaufen, we should point out, had come to the south to reclaim his rightful possession, and he was defeated with pretty cunning flank attack by Charles. We talked about flank attacks in recent videos about medieval tactics, and that's a very important feature, especially of the 13th century warfare. In Western Europe, that's where it reaches the peak, and also in here, why? It's not like flank attacks were not happening before, or like in the story, they had to wait around the Valerie to simply suggest Charles to adopt the tactics because he had been at the Crusades, he had seen the Turks doing it. It always existed, probably existed in every battle from both sides. It's just we don't see it. And remember, right, because I studied this, I published something on it. Every time you hear about this tactic, it's because it succeeded. Now, how statistically possible is it? That of course nobody in the sources even bothers to explain, but it's obvious once you, in fact, are a bit aware of the wall, and so you realize it was a much more common thing than ever. Simply, the 13th century is much better documented, and regardless of what people fixate, because they don't understand that medieval warfare has ups and downs, and that late medieval warfare is not the most important thing that happened in medieval warfare, but it's exactly this moment, 1250, 1350, roughly, that medieval civilization booms. Not even certain parts of early modern history were so advanced, like in that period, that these armies were massive, and they also were at this point composed of battle lines deployed in depth, that favors a flank attack because you can sort of more easily strike this order and mess up this order differently from, say, armies deployed on a single line with divisions next to one another on the flanks, which is what starts happening with smaller armies after the mid-14th century crisis, including the ones of the condottieri, for example, that everybody says, oh my god, let's make yet another video about the condottieri because, it sounds so exotic. It's like the Italians at this point, right? It's the meme. And you don't even know Italian warfare between 1250 and 1350 that is overwhelmingly more important than that, right? Especially speaking of the art of war with these armies, right? I made some videos about the late Italian communal armies, late communal Italian armies, say better. They were by far the single most advanced armies of the time, together with just the ones of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. I think, however, just by we should actually calculate how many times big armies of that kind were mobilized. I think Italy comes first, right? France surely had, but still, at the beginning of the 14th century, Philippe de Comines is very open in saying that the bandes d'ordonnance were copied after the Italian armies of the northern Italian Ghibelline lords, with 5,000-6,000 barbute at some point. And people still think, by the way, that medieval armies were somehow small, right? Study this period. If you do not know this period, you don't know anything, but I mean literally anything about the entire medieval art of war. It simply means that you fall into the trail of, I heard this from somebody else, and you have no idea of the entire system. Charles of Anjou's victory in 1268 was really crushing. It managed to suppress the rebellion of the last Swabian supporters in southern Italy that had not disappeared. Like, again, it's not you win a single battle and everybody is suppressed. In the process, especially southern Italy was an extremely big, populated, rich system. It had this hotbeds of resistance going on, which would actually increase in the later period of Charles' reign. There are all the battle of Naples, right, where his son was captured by Roger of Lauria. You have the rise of Roger de Flor at this point in this sort of piratical coastal dimension, where you see with difficulty vous, even in the broader struggle between the Angevins and the Aragonese across the straits. In any case, yes, the Angevins had accomplished this clamorous victory. That's also why they started having all this backlash. In any case, there was also great the power deployability in this. Again, controlling certain parts of southern Italy, paradoxically, even in fact as the king of Sicily, of Naples at this point, because that's where the Angevins had shifted the capital to be closer to Rome. That was the interest. It was not so important as to control, in fact, places like Rome, indirectly even, but just by hegemony, and supporting this Guelph axis in central and northern Italy. For obvious reasons, because this was the broader hub of general trade, production, wealth. Again, the Italian city-states of the center of the north were the ones over this story had sort of been fought over. I mean, the entire point of this Swabian wars against the Lombard League was hegemonizing the entire peninsula. It was essentially creating a new center of the empire in Rome or in Palermo, say, and ruling the Holy Roman Empire from there, just like in ancient times, which also makes most obvious sense considering the general situation in Europe and in Mediterranean. So, by this point, of course, this was a gigantic, a cyclopic enterprise that only the Hohenstaufen, the peak of the imperial Catholic tradition, just hoped to resume. At this point, the Angevins were extremely powerful because it's not like they stopped there. As you know, Charles was the brother of Louis IX. So this was a French empire, essentially. Like the accomplishment of what roughly like the Germans had hoped of achieving, and that by now had failed with the cruel decapitation of the same Conradin captured at Tagliacozzo. And so everything from the Channel to the Aegean Sea was this massive crescent, let's say, of French, Guelph, Papal, Angevin power, controlling de facto the single most advanced powers in Europe. I mean, France and Italy really were, and having also broader hegemonic aims on other lands. You know that Philip III invades and dies in the Kingdom of Aragon. Then Philip IV tries to retake the entirety of Flanders that technically did belong to the Kingdom of France. There are lots of very interesting things going on, including, of course, the central northern Italian balance, because, as we just said, not all those city-states were Guelph, right? There were many Ghibellines that had still contacts with Germany. Whoever was there was a broader Ghibelline part in Europe. For example, the Aragonese were, in a sense, Ghibelline, right? Even the Castilians that had Swabian blood dynastically that participated, for example, to the same battle of Tagliacozzo. It was actually the Castilians who broke through the French lines in the first engagement next to the Germans and the Italians that were present there. So there is really a lot of this is again the peak of universalism of medieval Europe, broadly met as a great cathedral. Thus, the main strategy in the Italian kingdom was for Charles to send some actually small contingents of Provençal, Neapolitan, French knights. Consider there is a lot of internationalization in warfare, so actually Charles sends, just like Manfred, for example, Swabia did not have much of a feudal southern Italian army. He mostly hired German mercenaries. Charles of Anjou would do basically the same with the French. The Italian city-states themselves are actually hiring these Transalpine troops. Think that after the Treaty of Caltabellotta, so this truce that was signed between the Angevins and the Aragonese that would actually resume the wars, not much to matter, but for a while, like the actual Almogabares, so this this Catalan Navarrese Aragonese troops that are also more famous for Roger de Flor, the Catalan Company, etc., that were coming from Aragon, and so that had fought against the Angevins that were invading Sicily, trying to retake it, were now without a job, and so they were hired by the Angevins, who simply sent them in northern Italy at levels of, I don't know, 200, 300, 400, 500 men maximum, in this or that city. The most important, of course, was Florence, for so many different reasons, but you have Pistoia, Brescia, Alessandria, Piacenza, so it's literally all across the region that serve as garrisons, fundamentally, because the deal for Charles here was to make all trade working smoothly. Of course, now with the Guelph hegemony, southern Italy profited as well from the general stabilization in the center and the north, so we trade with northern Europe and so on. So if the Neapolitans sent these garrisons to stabilize the internal situation, to back the Guelph party, because of course the Ghibellines would have remained either in the city or in the district, even when they were exiled, because they would have been backed by some other power. There would have been enough political stability to cash a lot. Of course, like we're talking medieval times, the income is a lot, but it's also relatively precarious. The interesting thing here is that Charles acts as a broader protector. He actually becomes lord of some of these cities by name, by the way, committing himself to pay for a consistent part of the city's military expenses. This is crucial because the sense of these communes was, we don't want to pay too much money for wars that are actually big, right? And after the death of Frederick II, these cities had actually started to fight against one another with an increasingly large amount of forces, where you start seeing really a massive development in the art of war, the greatest interaction between cavalry and infantry at the collective level of these battle lines of 10,000 men each, that are able to very orderly, very effectively clash against one another in these massive engagements. And of course this cost a disproportionate lot. So Charles' policy was to properly stop these initial clashes, to stabilize the entire system, and to allow these communes to prosper. There are lots of very interesting implications regarding the political, the policies, the military activities of these regimes. For example, the Visconti of Milan, the most important city in northern Italy, that were Ghibellines, initially used a great deal of communal troops, meaning that the Milanese citizenry was going at war regularly from actually a condition of strength, because the Milanese at this point had began to, like with the end of the Swabians, to fully take over at least the rest of Lombardy. And so of course they were obliging other communes to participate to these expeditions. Essentially the Lombard League becomes the army of Milan to a degree. And there are even many footmen in these expeditions. That means that the people were squeezed for doing so, but still there was a relentless expansion. It is very relevant for today's political thinking, because people whine just like at the time, and I can tell it ended badly for most of these Italian city-states, because all those who whined they didn't want to go at war, basically they were conquered by someone that was going at war, and obliged to keep paying for their military expenses in the process. Admittedly, they weren't going at war themselves anymore. That's how the condottieri came to be. Like, there was a lot of cash, a lot of wealth, a lot of financial support, in that case of Lombardy, it was essentially the Milanese bankers sponsoring these wars, sponsoring the Ghibelline regime, and cashing the banks of all the other subjected peoples, with which the Milanese eventually, as we will see now, start hiring lots of mercenaries. However, when the Guelphs win with Charles of Anjou, etc., the Visconti are expelled from Milan. And it's not like, again, it's much of a just what was happening in southern Italy. Much of that, yes, but it's also an internal Milanese thing, right? You have always to understand these levels from the international, the regional, the local, because this city's histories are extremely complicated. That's also one of the reasons, as I was saying before, as why they're not studied. I will actually start a series on the Italian 14th and 15th century that will really examine in detail all these various individual histories, because otherwise you can't really understand the period entirely, and that's of course a pity. Now, the Visconti are kicked out by the Della Torre, all right, that are Guelph, and that start ruling the city, actually increasing their own seigneurial power, much more than the Visconti have done. Right? Of course, they are supported by the oligarchy and so on, but they also make this populistic policy of not sending much the army out there anymore. Just they hire a bulk of pretty expensive mercenaries that are not as big as what the Milanese commune can field. That is literally 30,000 men. They did so, like Florence and Milan. Look at it, like the campaigns, especially for Florence, the campaigns after Campaldino. They had 30,000 men on campaign, multiple occasions. And that's all the people would tell you that medieval warfare had small armies and etc. Florence, even more than Milan, on one occasion, 2 armies at a time, not a total of 60,000 men, but still on 2 different fronts and still regional forces. These are the biggest cities, of course. Most Italian warfare at this point was of coalition, which means, of course, that the single cities contributed less normally, but that's exactly the point. We're still the same regional hubs, like, I don't know, Lombardy, Tuscany, and they did field armies of 20, 30,000 men altogether, because that was the way war was made to begin with. That the need for such large armies operationally, strategically, was kind of obvious, also considering how dotted, in fact, this land was of cities, of real city-states, not like, I don't know, towns that were more or less ennobled by some bourgeois elite. Here we're talking entire states that had a military as large individually, like Milan and Florence individually. Armies as large as the King of France's, right? I'm not kidding about this. Nobody seems to look at this. If you can check, for example, I don't know, even who's that other guy? The ones from the War Games series. They make the lists of how big these communes armies were. They make just one example from Lucca, I think, for the entire period. And Lucca was a sort of medium-sized city that at some point actually fields tens of thousands of men. But they pick just a small number of, I don't know, of one occasion that, of course, they signed it from the literal hundreds that exist in plain light through the vast historiography. And everybody knew about each other. That was that publicly well, informed and reliable. Like, I don't know, 400 knights and 6,000 infantry. That is a consistent contingent. It's not like it was small, but we have more, and we have evidence of more also because we know very well how many inhabitants they had, how realistic it was just for them to field them, and so on. So, again, you check these disclosure works that are allegedly there to make people understand how things were, and they literally are saying, I do not know a blip about this period because I'm an ignorant, but I will use the same sort of weird skepticistic behavior because I can't believe that this was actually a way more advanced place than I've ever been told, proving that, in fact, I do not know a blip about medieval warfare. Never mind. Or European history to begin with. Never mind double time. So this we were talking about the Della Torre, right? And the Visconti come back at a point with the expedition of Henry VII in 1310, 1311. That goes on, of course, that's when he arrived, and only at that point the Visconti come back, and essentially they are more powerful lords than before, but there is this still sense of citizenry alive that not even the Torriani dynasty had sort of weakened too much, and it's only in the 20s of the 14th century that the Visconti start becoming actually the most famous example of men-at-arms, mercenary, say, recruitment, in lieu of the full communal army that indeed declines by the 30s, the 40s. Also with the general crisis of the era, like the plague and so on. And that opens to the face of the condottieri, that were in fact mostly men-at-arms, as that figure I gave you before, 5,000-6,000 barbuta, was relying about, indeed, the Visconti army. Consider the guy was a Florentine, so it's not like that he was a black Guelph, so the Visconti were the most Ghibellines, and that should make you think. But back to Charles of Anjou, military protection. Actually, the morale of that story, as we saw there, is that that paradoxically, people preferred a seigneury, demilitarizing them and making mercenaries fighting in their stead, than maintaining an active strong citizenry in arms that could simply conquer other peoples and become richer. That's really the history of civilization in a nutshell. Instead of promoting further that power, you have an involution. This is true for every place, basically. It's something we see now. I mean, who does want to go to war in Europe today compared to, 100 years ago? Unfortunately, that's not a good thing at all. But again, populous, lesser people think apparently that it's something to be proud of, to say out loud. If they knew anything about history, they would think twice about this. As we were saying before, there are many central and northern Italian city-states that grant Charles of Anjou the authority to appoint the podestà, the facto the military commander that got the mandate from the commune to lead the army and balance, say, local politics, through the same Charles that, of course, was deeply connected with all these people. As we said before, there weren't actually so many foreign mercenaries at this point yet, right? This starts happening mostly from the 20s of the, from Henry VII's expedition, with all the Germans that had remained in Italy after the emperor's death and were hired, for example, by Uguccione della Faggiola for the same battle of Monte Catina. It's not for it, but I mean, they happened to fight there, and they were hyper-loaded, hating the Guelphs and the Angevins, because they wanted to avenge Conrad, and there were these deep beliefs at the time. Remember, especially the Ghibellines believed in a very organic, traditional doctrine, in a broader sense. I'm writing an article actually exactly on this. And Charles of Anjou was in mostly just about stabilizing the system, not squeezing it, not bringing other peoples to act in an iron-fisted way. This may sound strange, but so it is. Like, Charles was a pretty cold, brutal, also very skilled, very capable individual, and he realizes that he does not have to oppress these communes. He has to simply pay for some of their military expenses, protection, making trade flow, and things would go well. There was no major German power threatening anyone anymore. If anything, it was literally the French that now had such upper hand. And so he committed himself to provide the defense of the territory of these communes at his own expense. Naturally, there was a significant share of taxes collected by the Angevins themselves, but it was not heavy. It was just, okay, he will think about that level of military expenditure, and for the rest, he's not going to interfere that much. And much actually of these provisions were simply accepted by cities that were a bit more on the outskirts of this system and that needed a bit more of that Angevin protection. For example, the Treaty of 1270 between Charles and Brescia, that is just next to Milan and in the north and the Alpine foothills, and doesn't feel very steady because it's surrounded by Ghibellines, stipulated that if any city, faction, or individual declared war on Brescia or her districts under the king's rule, the king was obliged to defend them fully at his own cost and conduct military action on their behalf, maintaining an army and an adequate number of armed soldiers in those territories at his expense. We know this from the Liber Poteris Communis Civitatis Brixiae. Brescia is not big city or whatever, but for this reason, they had accepted Charles' signory, which means simply not like he was a king enthroned, whatever. He was just, again, someone offering protection, especially in this fringe territory compared to the center of Guelph hegemony that mostly was Tuscany and some parts of the Po Valley, not this one. And so the deal was pretty much wanted. Brescia, for example, would be the one that called John of Bohemia at the beginning of the 14th century, because she knew that she would have been eaten alive by the neighbors, and so that's how John of Bohemia's journey in Italy began. It was a very fairy tale like, a largely ineffective one, but it's still how the signory began. I made some videos about the Italian signori and that sense of tyrannical streak that was inexplicably attributed by historiography, considering that there were literal monarchic kingdoms in Europe, but the Italian signori were tyrants for some reason, even though they had the most egalitarian republican government and regimes of the entire Europe at the time. But you see how this is in part the Black Legend. It's part the idea of the perpetual decadence of Italy, and this kind of mentality was mostly stuck to this phase labeled, pre-packed for being consumed just in some oddly, I would say, inconvenient ways, because you can't really even start being serious about such things. And it's not like saying that simply being egalitarian or republican brings you always the better advantages. Actually, this is often a trick. There were cities, for example, were capable of maintaining that, but the greatest powers in Europe would also not be them to a degree. So let's be honest with our own political compass, because it's not really a matter of personal opinion at times. Now, Charles' death in 1285 and the prolonged absence of the Angevins from the northern Italian political scene, at least in a direct way, did not considerably diminish the Guelph alignment, which continued to, in fact, effectively coordinate numerous cities. These cities were not actually at full peace at all, even under the Guelph hegemony. They weren't making Charles pay for that stabilization through the military, that are just some smaller military contingents, as if they didn't have massive armies on their own on a regular basis. As we said before, Charles did not really control these cities in a direct sense. He just had an influence on them, and they actually kept fighting a lot of wars among one another. The Guelph of Germany did not put an end at all. Like you could say the Angevin in Germany did not put an end at all to the regional clashes in Lombardy, in Tuscany, and also all the surrounding areas, because those were actually the ones where there was more instability, infiltration. The areas of Romagna, for example, very interesting. What mattered really was to strengthen the military ties of these cities. That's what the Angevin Guelph hegemony had actually accomplished. Right? There had been the affirmation of a relatively stable civic commonwealth possessing a partisan yet almost national outlook on political issues. Because the partes, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, were more than ever a matter of international concern. Actually, as you know, not just the Italianate name Guelph Ghibellines refers to the fact that these factions came to be much more important in the Italian peninsula than elsewhere, but there was a veritable escalation, especially since not even Frederick II's times, when of course the emperor had been violently attacked by propaganda. He used the same against the Pope, etc. But from Manfred's times, it's in Manfred times that Guelphs and Ghibellines start being fully defined on an international level, because they are able to link themselves in a strategic sense. Essentially, it's impossible, at least with my technical means, to illustrate this properly. But if you were to make, a video about the sort of regime change from Guelph to Ghibelline into these various Italian city-states over the next half century, you would see how, and dotting also the major battles in the scene, the extension of the seigneuries, also of other cities, you would realize why this was the case. Because only at this point, after the Swabians were out, the Italians began to form those aforementioned massive armies, up to 30,000 actual fighters that would clash brutally to systematically subjugate one another. Except they were so well balanced at the beginning of this period, again, 30 virtually independent city-states, that these wars went over and over and over and over, and they were fueled by the greatest amount of per capita wealth, and by far, in the entire world at the time, which tells you how and why they made so much war. I mean, Contamine pointed this out, that Italy was truly the most belligerent country at this time, which is also quite telling, because, as I always say, civilization does not actually decrease the level of destructiveness, in potential at least. The Italians, of course, do not get destroyed by this. They actually get even more sort of pumped up by this phenomenon, because in fact the regional states are born out of this mechanism, out of this dynamic. And the Guelph of Germany had contributed to consolidate such mutual assistance from one another. Naples sent troops to the most relevant, the most important centers. These used them next to their own army, that was bigger, of course, than any of these forces that could be sent by Naples. It was actually a great effort from the Angevin side that remains consistent also during the wars with the Aragonese, that of course are coordinated with the Ghibellines as well, that initially are less unified. Indeed, the Ghibelline cities, especially in this period up to the even the arrival of Henry VII are really a bit on their own, right? They're the minority. They are actually holding tight, and they did manage to score important successes as well. However, they lacked a stable point of reference and tying themselves to different rivals of Angevin power that also had their own specific interests. For example, Frederick III of Aragon, Alfonso X of Castile, and numerous claimants to the imperial crown as well that, as you know, at this point were during the Great Interregnum anyway. We talked about Richard of Cornwall, we talked about St. Alfonso. So this was a problem for them because even though they could and would get subsidized to a degree, so with some, say, parallel, some similarity to what we've seen with the Guelphs from the Angevins, they would also have to take mostly matters in their own hands and did not have a fixed center of power. They did not have a single source, one that could simply politically and strategically organize in a rational, effective way this struggle. The Angevins also did not really have many reasons to push further. Actually, Charles of Anjou and his successors' greatest ambition was to reconquer Constantinople, which is sort of obvious. Actually, if the very Sicilian Vespers were caused by this. Charles of Anjou, just like Henry VI before him, was launching from southern Italy an expedition that would have reconquered Constantinople. By the way, there is no doubt about that. There is a general doubt, but the Byzantines notoriously did not have what to defend the city with at that particular time. They were even lucky, by the way, but that French involvement also in the Balkans was consistent, and southern Italy was the launch pad, right? Only the Ghibellines really have to wait until the years 1310, 1311, with the arrival of Henry VII, to at least achieve significant coordination at an Italian level. Why? Because essentially the empire was coming back in the guise of Henry VII, that was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, in a Rome that was literally fortified, entrenched with the Guelphs from one side and the Ghibellines from another. That was possibly the one of May 1312, the largest urban battle in medieval Europe. Have you ever heard of that? No. Why? Because no alleged scholar had the decency of simply posing themselves the questions and, looking at it. Which, although did not really recompact any major German power, not just because Henry died, he was on the way to Naples, and in that case Naples did not have much defense. So many people have this defeatistic attitude towards Henry VII just because they repeat this trope from somebody else about Dante saying, oh my god, he died and whatever, so it was bad. So Henry VII, so this equates to Henry VII did nothing. No, he did a huge deal, especially in northern Italy, where in fact the area was recompacted under a Ghibelline dominance. Right? From there on, the Ghibellines would have the upper hand in the Po Valley. Overall, there were lots of cities, but essentially with the Visconti that, as we were saying before, came back to Milan, together with Henry, that kicks out the Torriani, and the Della Scala, also, that are given Vicenza, stripped from Padua, from their sort of Veronese background, become imperial vicars for their respective, the Visconti for Lombardy, the Della Scala for the so-called Trevisan Mark, and they will remain in charge And the other major Guelph player there is Padua, that gets, however, crushed by the La Scala at the end of the day. Also Bologna, that, however, does not venture north of the Po River anyway, and that is actually the one that gets under attack. Other very famous battle, the one at Zappolino. You will find this battle on YouTube. You know why? Because of the story of debacle by that. It's actually a legend from the Middle Ages, but the poem by Tassoni, and not because that they interpret it as if these people killed themselves in the tens of thousands, literally at Zappolino, because somebody had stolen a cattle. And literally everybody knows this, or at least, look, this is the Italian war. And nobody knows the single most important clash that was occurring at the time between Guelph, Bologna, and the Bonacolsi of Mantua, the same Visconti, and the Della Scala. That's, for example, the same year, the Battle of Altopascio, that people hear, and you will find it in the Oxford Medieval Cambridge, because Castruccio and so, but maybe that's a Machiavellian thing, that we at least idealize this, because that's how it arrived. Like, we idealize Castruccio, because why? Because again, Machiavelli wrote it. And then, does anybody know about Castruccio? Does everybody know what his military curriculum was? Does everybody know, what he did in England or in Flanders? Just what is written also about him from some Flemish sources about the battle, the French-Flemish War, the Battle of Tournai, or any other battle other than Altopascio, and what, for example, did the Florentines do under Angevin guidance after Altopascio in the following years along the Arno Valley, military-wise? Nobody, of course. I don't know, if this had been, English history, we would have made entire TV series, shows, and this would have been the most important things ever. This, by scale, were also more important things than what were happening in England at the time. If anything, by size and more. But I'm not, as you know, I actually love England. I have a huge respect for medieval English history, for British culture, and the Anglosphere as well, that I criticize a lot. We have a lot to criticize ourselves for our continental issues, one of which is that important histories like the ones of France. I'm talking a lot about Italy, but in many ways this is a problem with France as well. This is a problem with Germany as well. How many people consider, especially this triad, as something you have to look at more than a curiosity, something more than in function of something else, right? Why some condottieri battles are told, because maybe, John Hawkwood was there, but in comparison, in a strictly objective military sense, does anybody know the entire strategic, operational, and tactical essence of the Battle of Zappolino, other than the capital story that is also made up? I would pose myself such questions in a very, very, very serious way. Because, you see, I study history because at least I think that without that you can't understand the world you live in. So if there is a major gap, or there is something that properly you even distort to some degree, and you find out that this is the case, the first feeling I have about it is the urgency of fixing it. First thing comes into my mind, first motivation. It's, I think, a duty, if anything. So the Ghibellines will find that coordination, including the one, for example, that would be that would make them able to crush, to annihilate the Bolognese army at Zappolino, thanks to the arrival of Henry VII. The fact that they hired lots of his German mercenaries that were coming back to Germany, and that they are hired by Pisa, by Milan, etc., and opening also to a bit the true beginning of what we start seeing like the age of the condotta, even though the condotta existed already before. That's yet another thing we have to discuss quite seriously. In any case, we can start seeing how from the last quarter of the 13th century, typically these opposing blocks of communes acting in concert, forming large coalitions bolstered by contributions from a wide array of allied cities. Bear in mind, there are not just the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. At least, there is in theory also there some further subdivision. People especially say that there were the white Guelphs that were some sort of third thing, but it wasn't really the case. Like, white Guelph literally meant Ghibelline, right? It's not true. There isn't a sort of more definitive doctrine behind white Guelphism than black Guelphism. The reason why you distinguish that is mostly Dante again, and the fact that in Florence there was now a rigidly Guelph city, and that there couldn't be Ghibellines, because that would have just placed the city on a completely different footing, like the same one that, say, in terms of international relations, connecting with some German or Aragonese power, there was no space for that, but Guelphs, mandatory Guelphs, were to try to recover some greater autonomy, especially from the papal and Angevin interference. At some point was very high. I mean, the exile of Dante stems from that. It was de facto a military occupation, one that was aimed at expelling the less faithful group, and then of course Florence would kept remaining, being governed by herself, but by a very black regime, Guelph regime. So that those exiles keep, in this case, calling themselves Guelph, but they're de facto Ghibellines. The same is true for Bologna, for example. Many cities, again, change this orientation. Lucca, for example, is one of those, but we're talking slightly later in this case, like already the beginning of 14th century. But it was the case already from before, as we've seen in the video about the Battle of Montaperti for the same Florence, that had produced the situation we're just describing. What I meant before is that, yes, you have these two standards blocks. So the Ghibellines and the white Guelphs that cooperate with the Ghibellines anyway. So mostly it's the Tuscans and the Emilians, Florence and Bologna, that have this thing of the white Guelphs. Like, you don't find it elsewhere, fundamentally. The rest it's just Guelph of Ghibelline. In Lombardy, they didn't have white Guelphism, for example. But there are provincial leagues, right? For example, the Lombard League at this point was, under the Visconti was Ghibelline, under the, which sounds insane, because, you think, but how? The Lombard League, the same Lombard League, had been the one that had been fighting against the Hohenstaufen, yes, but the situation had changed. And say, under the Torriani, it was a Guelph alliance, and later it's actually the Milanese that are best partners of Henry the Seventh. There is some attrition. It's not like they like the Germans more than much. They're very ambitious. They know that they were the ones who defeated Barbarossa at Legnano. There is all that sense of municipalism ingrained in such centers that are in fact the real protagonists of this all. When you see all these foreign interventions, you realize that largely they were paid by the Italians. The same army of Henry VII had been decimated in the first years. The siege of Brescia with the plague. Also, some relatives of Henry died because of that. The wars, the disasters, the Battle of Rome, the disastrous siege of Florence. And then he didn't have many other troops. And so when Henry goes to Pisa, he receives lots of forces, and they're mostly from the rest of Italy, so that when he was marching towards the south and he died, most of his armies was made up of locals. If anything, they received a lot of money after the failed siege of Florence, for example, Henry receives a lot of money from Aragon. It was the same one subsidizing other Ghibellines at this point. Not so much, telling the truth. Also consider that Sicily and Aragon are not quite literally the same thing at this point. We say the Aragonese because, yes, it was the same house of Aragon, but at times Aragon and Aragonese Sicily were hostile to one another. So you understand how many different branches there are. Then you have, just like in Lombardy, there is the Lombard League, there is the Tuscan League in Tuscany. There is the Romagnol system of alliances. All these places have their own ways. For example, between 1275 and 1290, the pro-imperial cities in Italy at large were led by William VII of Montferrat, who, as you know, was at the head of essentially a feudal principality in Piedmont. It was one of the areas that had remained a bit more feudalized in Italy. And this guy, of course, controlled also the communes because they coexisted. And in particular, this formidable coalition, in fact, of urban centers in Lombardy and Piedmont, supported by an army centered around a corps of Montferrine knights, augmented by troops from allied locations. And this, again, was completely normal. If you study in depth this military history, you realize that the entire system was based on backing one another. I mean, there is a war between, what can I tell you? Modena and Reggio in Emilia, for example. You have Piacenza sending 100 mercenaries to help Reggio, and then, Modena is aided by, Bologna, or maybe they are actually at war with one another. So everything is so intertwined. They send us these little groups, and then there is the bulk of the communal army. That's where the distinction between mercenaries and the local armies starts appearing, because also the citizens can't stay all the time at war. They complain, it's an issue, so they prefer to pay themselves, to risk their life to begin with. And this expenses are actually very big. Consider that towards the end of the 13th century, the boom of medieval civilization starts stagnating, right? And so these clashes are so relevant because they kind of pave the way for the 14th century crisis. It wasn't much the plague per se, it was the preconditions of Europe, the ceaseless wars that this massive system had been able to sustain, that at some point burn the system out and render it more fragile, more vulnerable. Right? In the Italian city-states, the affirmation of the signory basically passes through this dynamic, through essentially the end of the communal army as we know it, the rise of the condottieri, the mercenary forces, and with that general, again, sinking of the lower strata that you witness throughout all the later Middle Ages, and that paradoxically will bring back to the rise of infantry in the mid-15th century, not because these people had any power on their own, but because it was princes that could simply hire them as proletarians. And also with much less individual quality than before. And important was the pike square and also pretty unrefined individual pike fencing that, however, was compensated by the much greater collective training. And you don't have to underestimate how collectively trained these Italian armies were at the time, at all, because forces, again, of tens of thousands, with one single line composed of, in fact, tens of thousands between knights and infantrymen, the latter being numerically superior, but being able to always fight next to the knights. Very orderly. It's something you don't find even in Renaissance warfare by the size of armies. Look at the size of armies, let's say, the Italian wars of the early 16th century. They're not as big as the ones of late communal Italy. But nobody pointed ever out, right? In this period, by the way, there is another important dynamic in Italy. That is the rise of Tuscany, unavoidably connected with the Angevin regime. Essentially, the Angevin crusade against Manfred of Sicily had been prepaid through the Pope by the Guelphs bankers of Tuscany that were emerging because they were engaging in sort of more commercial bourgeois activity, because Tuscany was less socially stratified than Lombardy. It had historically been less interconnected. This had prevented actually a strong oligarchy to take over. There were still oligarchic system. Again, these were not mercantile republic as people would like to dispatch it to you, even if the major, the oligarchs were at the head of commercial guilds and so on, but it's not like their lifestyle was the one of a merchant. They were men at arms. And the general, the victory, of course, of the Angevins in southern Italy had brought the winners to pay, essentially to repay their debts to these Tuscans by subcontracting them. It's really typical, of course, of the era, because nobody really had so much money except these very Italians to land, right? But to actually exploit the southern Italian trade resources, in particular the grain imports from Sicily that was needed to feed the mobs of this bigger and rampingly expanding Tuscan communes. That's the perfect deal. That's how essentially the Tuscans come to administer southern Italy. At that point, we will talk about that, Queen Jeanne, etc. There are lots of very interesting diatriaiuoli, very important figures. Think about Boccaccio's novelle, many of which take place in Naples, because he had gone there at some point to practice banking before the great failure of the Bardi, in fact, after which he came back to Tuscany. That's a very also funny literature to read, aside from the general drama surrounding this world picture. And so the Tuscans, exactly because they are a bit more sort of Republican-minded, they have this sense of the importance of their connection. There's not really of course, Florence is the most important city by this point, but throughout this entire period, the Florentines will not have the capacity to assert their control over Tuscany. They tried, but they failed. Especially, the only major success was Campaldino in 1289. We'll see it in a while a bit better. But before this, there were just many other cities. They were one of the many other centers. The most important of which were, in fact, in this Guelph blocket list, Lucca, at least by this point, Siena. Siena was actually more important. It was the second after Florence. Pistoia, Prato, Volterra. There is a scaling difference. I don't know, cities like Volterra or San Gimignano were pretty small. They would be subsumed by Florence just by financial hegemony. Prato took an incredibly bloody siege to capture. I made a video about this together with some broader examples of Florentine political vendetta. These cities, however, I listed, primarily driven by Florence, organized themselves with this enduring military apparatus that is the Guelph League of Tuscany. In 1281, these communes form an alliance against Pisa and other Ghibelline cities of Tuscany. By the way, I have a series about the Italian communes that tells the history of each and every one of these cities. Not entirely made part of Florence, then I made Siena and Pisa that are very important. We have to make Arezzo, that was also a Ghibelline rival, of course, of Florence, the ones that are defeated, in fact, at Campaldino. The term for this Tuscan alliance was actually was centered on a contract. It was known as the talia in Italian vernacular, talia in Latin. Essentially, a certain amount of money put together by these communes for hiring a collective body of heavy cavalry, financed in this collaborative way and composed essentially of mercenary troops. Of course, the 13th century witnesses a brusque monetization of warfare, made lots of videos on this. This is particularly evident in Tuscany, where, of course, monetization was skyrocketing, to say the least, and in fact, nightly, say that the mercenary availability was that fluidified as a consequence. In fact, it was explicitly stipulated that these fighters of the talia should be French, or at the very least foreign, well-equipped and staunchly loyal to the Guelph cause. Actually, we do not fully know whether all these troops were really French. It would be somehow, I mean, as we'll see now, in this early era, there are not so many. In fact, the talia is not the army proper. The talia is just, again, this corps, which is not even a corps in the backbone of the army in any way. Maybe some of these were really elite troops, so yes, they used them also as a shock force, but they weren't decisive. I mean, these communes, first of all, could field, as we've seen, tens of thousands of troops at a time together. So, and in the case of Florence, for example, or Pisa, they had literally armies of 30,000 men. I mean, I regularly fielded. You can check this out. I will make videos if you are interested in that, just for, again, those who say that medieval armies were small, that individual cities did not have manpower, or this BS. The point, though, was establishing some sort of common goal. I mean, it was about being fair about this common expense for the common good, testing in a political fashion the loyalty of these communes to the cause, and of course also having sort of more efficient, lighter form of organization, because these troops would have been eventually deployed just in one place. This is the advantage that also money bring. Like, I put money in common. I don't have really to organize. Mostly it's Florence that organizes this. Florence is really the major logistical hub for the Guelph axis. It's very close to the Apennine passes connecting her to Bologna. And so the Po Valley, it is the biggest city in Tuscany. It is the richest one. They take care of that. It's actually a privilege, as a matter of fact. But if I am, for example, these are not just Tuscans, by the way. There are lots of Umbrians. I don't know, I'm Foligno and I want to sign with the Guelph League of Tuscany. I pay my share of money for, I don't know, 20 knights of the talia. I'm good with it. And it's not like they were doing it as an alm, like they didn't want. What strikes you is that they had, especially the smaller centers, this incredibly crystal clear idea of how important it was to contribute personally to such military expedition. The talia was also renovated. We don't unfortunately know with which frequency. Historiography at least seems to have taken this talia for some sort of semi-permanent type of force, but it's actually not a big deal. This is not, literally, the Guelph League is something, the talia is just a side of this, right? It's just to fluidify again, to simply say, okay, we have in common the certain amount of troops that we can employ. Depending on fact their needs, the strength of the talia fluctuated between 300 and 600 knights. It's not a lot. Admittedly, there were also infantrymen of the specialized types. One talia document, for example, talks about a force of I think these were several thousand infantrymen, and 1/3 was to be equipped with pikes, 1/3 with crossbows, and 1/3 with pavises. Even though we have no clear idea, as I explained also in a recent video about the Polish shield bearers, Polish infantrymen that were known as klipeati, so it's a different thing. Like in this case, what these pavismen actually were. Because everybody has an idea of the later medieval pavismen, but in communal Italy, where this was actually born for infantry to the scale that we know, there wasn't actually such clear distinction. Like we would know that the pavismen were not shield bearers, were actually probably melee troops themselves. In any case, this is not so important. It's just actually it is, because it's not a few. Like if, as we were saying before, on those again, I can't remember what's the war games, medieval warfare. Again, whatever. But if they tell you that Lucca could simply field more or less the same type of troops, which was not true, they could do more. Just know that the talia, that represented a fraction of the total forces of the Guelphs of Tuscany, was just in fact that small compared to the forces it could actually field. Florence again fields 30,000 men at the end of the 13th century, and it's not strange at all. So it's more like a guarantee of some sort. Historiography has somehow emphasized this because it's archive stuff, and so, oh look, archive stuff, that must be the most important thing ever, except again, if you study warfare, like from the chronicles, all the battles, all the campaigns, all the political history of the year in detail, you know that they moved so many more troops on a regular basis against one another, and so this talia is not even mentioned by other sources, which is interesting because it shows it was not even that relevant, and of course there was much more manpower around. Now, the interesting thing that we noticed before for the talia is that there had to be Frenchmen apparently for the Guelph side. This was true for the Ghibellines as well. For example, when Rudolf of Habsburg comes to power, and as you know, he puts an end, ideally, to the interregnum as king of the Romans. He planned, I think, 3-4 times an Italian expedition, but he couldn't because the situation in Germany was pretty messed up. But he subsidized the Ghibellines, and at some point he sends some mercenaries to Arezzo, Tuscany, that was Ghibelline. Now these guys reject these mercenaries. You know why? Because they were Burgundians. Essentially, they were French speakers from the Holy Roman Imperial lands. That, like Henry VII, for example, was Lorrainese basically, and so he spoke French, not even German that well, even though he was the Holy Roman Emperor. And the Aretines are dissatisfied because they say, these speak French, we cannot trust them. It's as if the Italians had interiorized at this point that if you were French, you were more prone to be against the Germans. Well, if you were a German, you would be pro-imperial cause and hate the French. This is an actual thing. In fact, when some regimes change in Italy at this point, you realize that the communal mercenaries nationality does as well. Piacenza, for example, has French mercenaries when she's Guelph. She has German mercenaries when she's Ghibelline. Right? Admittedly, in some cases they were brought by other people who occupied the city. In that case, as Ghibellines, the Visconti in Piacenza, they brought some Swabian mercenaries. And others that were roaming around. Naturally, there were French in the Ghibelline armies, in Cangrande's one, there were, and he was also one of the earliest guys to make that sort of, also a bit more of autonomous employment of troops. There were Germans in the Guelph side, but mostly later on, from the 20s, especially the 14th century, it is true that they had that greater affiliation to the Ghibelline cause. They are not, however, so many until the expedition of Henry VII. At that point, the Italians will actually have more German mercenaries under their command than the Holy Roman Emperor would have on his own. Like a king of Germany could muster in a single, like as the ruler of the land. So that speaks volumes, right? Literally, the Ghibellines of northern Italy tell Ludwig of Wittelsbach before his arrival in Italy, look, there is no need to bring any because we have more German knights than you have. This is it. How can't you love this period? It's amazing, right? So the talia, with various adaptations, remain active and effective for over 2 decades. It significantly contributed to Florentine's successes, such as the one of Campaldino in 1289 against a Ghibelline alliance led by Arezzo. However, again, in these battles, you see, for example, from the Florentine side, you have a French command, French Provençal command. From the Ghibelline side, you do not know of Germans, but surely there was some out there, because it was just normal to have these errant knights to begin with, aside from this more sort of managed international settings. However, in fact, in these battles, most of the troops were provided by other communes, not paid mercenaries. Some of them would be, but still by the same commune. I mean, sent by that single city. For example, Corso Donati, that was a Florentine magnate, that, as you know, would be killed in a attempted coup to make Florence a lordship of his own, was at that point the podesta of Lucca, of Pistoia, but he had Pistoiese and Lucchese troops that would be the ones that launched the flank attack against the Aretine force at Campaldino and destroyed it. This is interesting, of course. They were, I think, just 200 knights, but I mean, they were just, as you see here, like a consistent part of what the talia would have been, and that was just the reserve. The armies were, they had, the Aretines were not so many, were just 800 knights and 8,000 infantrymen, which is more than the talia could field. And Arezzo was also like a relatively small commune, right? The middle size by that point, and Florence crushes it. But Florence had something like more than 10,000 infantry and more than 2,000 knights, which also was a crushing superiority. And they almost lost to the Aretines. Florence is defeated by all these neighbors throughout all the following decades. It's insane. However, she manages to still become the most, to gradually overcome them just out of resilience, of this sense of... It is true, really, that the Guelph regimes were more chthonic, were more popular, were more infantry-based to a degree. Like they are actually alike, the others. Like, cavalry is more important, infantry subordinated. They're the same cities, they're the same country, they're the same people. But the Ghibellines have that greater, let's say, seigneurial bias. They like chivalry more, iron fist authority, cavalry charges, German knights, eagles, symbols of this kind. Living eagles. Like Uguccione della Faggiola takes over Pisa as lord by running with his German troops that eventually become institutionalized in Pisa as the official soldiery, that were initially these veterans of Henry VII's expedition, and they ran through the streets of Pisa with a living eagle flying over their heads. They had brought themselves, of course. And that tells you the entire spirit of it all. It's incredibly strong. Like, the entire age is permeated by these beliefs and this symbolism. in any case, for battles like Campaldino, we see that still, especially at this point, this is true throughout the entire 13th century, mercenarism is not central. This is not like the age of the condotta. These are statal armies where citizens fight in it, right? Actually, the majority, yes, would have been peasants from the district that were technically not citizens, but they're still like, locals, right? They're subjects, and they live in that. I just made a video about 12th century Florence and how the commune conquered the district. That's important. Also, to mitigate the risks associated with such concentrated forces, the soldiers were normally distributed among the various cities in accordance with the financial contributions made by each. We have seen this already under Charles of Anjou, that sent sort of a proportionate amount of troops to different cities. Florence would have the largest amount of troops because it was the biggest and most important. Ferrara would have less, right? Bologna more than Ferrara, etc. The troops would also be different in kind. For example, as we pointed out before, Charles of Anjou sends this Catalan, mostly infantrymen. They had knights among them, but they were differently from these French and Germans and Provençals, because we say French, but there were these other groups, the Burgundians, as they were called, these Lorrainese troops, that were all knights. They were all men-at-arms. Surely they had some infantry, but they never figure, where instead the Catalans are on foot. And so they also perform very differently. In fact, after Montecatini, Florence is so fed up with these Catalan forces that they literally write to the King of Aragon and says, "We do not want to have any of your subjects here around anymore." Remember that these were not, yes, they were Aragonese subjects, but they were soldiers sent by Charles of Anjou, which also means that, of course, many of these troops would also join simply through the same communes. And so here Florence, the priors were telling to the King of Aragon, control your population, do not make adventurers coming here anymore, because they were literally telling them, you're cowards, because they had apparently underperformed during the battle, and they were also like not very liked as a general garrison. For example, the ones of Ferrara were completely slaughtered by the insurrecting, not even Ghibellines. They wanted to make the Este coming back into power. The Este swung a bit, admittedly, in political factionalism there, but the Ferrarese did not like these Catalans. And in fact, from the mid-10th of the 14th century, the Catalans disappear. You see, these were, you will find on YouTube, oh my god, the greatest mercenaries of the era, the Roger de Flor, the Catalan company. Yes, in Greece, against the Turks. Also, yes, against the French, like the Duke of Athens. But in Italy, it's the other way around. The Italians want men-at-arms, as they will develop their condotta, their condottieri. That's why they want the French. That's what they want the Germans, right? From the mid-20s, you find essentially the same Guelphs saying to the King of Naples, because there is a general crisis anymore. Look, we don't want to depend on you on this anymore. We are allies and everything. We support each other. But first of all, you are actually not sending us as many troops as before. And secondly, we want to have them on our own account. We don't want to depend on you. And so the Florentines literally send people into France and into Germany to buy out essentially impoverished noblemen to serve into their armies. That they bring them to Italy. There are very interesting descriptions of these guys arriving to places like Florence, etc. And it is really amazing. It tells you how the system really worked. Except nobody studies it. Now, the command of the talia, just to stick to this, was entrusted to an Italian nobleman who was supported by a council of delegates from the communes participating in the league. which set the general strategic guidelines. However, the talia was intended to supplement local city armies rather than replace them, as we've seen. For instance, during a campaign against Arezzo, alongside 300 professional communal troops, there were as many as 1,500 knights supplied by the various members of the League. And this campaign is very important. It's actually the one in which you see that there were lots of also of cavallata forces that from Florence meant a specific amount of citizens or people fighting on their behalf that were required this equestrian service that was starting to become very burdensome for others. It was also an opportunity because there were some privileges coming with this participation, but it also shows you how here we have 1,500 troops just for this essentially Florentine army that are provided only by her allies. And this is they're literal men at arms, by the way. It's not like they are something like it's a massive force in as much as, of course, they would be accompanied by at least some thousand infantrymen each, and or ones that in any case Florence would provide alongside the knights, because that's normally the proportion, right? In a general sense, historiography said the normal ratio, at least in the Golden Age, which nobody really understands because this was actually the Golden Age of the communes, but in general would have been 1 knight and say 10 footmen or something like that. Actually, at this point, it's 1 knight and 4, 5, or men at arms, let's say better, because knight may be misleading, and 4 or 5 footmen for the middle-sized expeditions that are something between what we've seen now, essentially hundreds of knights and thousands of infantrymen. This is the regular amount of troops that happens often. Like it doesn't, if you study again the activity of these communes, that admittedly is very intense, also for European standards. Again, very rich, very infrastructurally served and fortified places. A lot of activity. It's happening every year, multiple times. And then you have the big climatic clashes in which you really have tens of thousands of men from both sides. And that's admittedly, the major clashes occur relatively rarely, which means at some years' distance, which is not even that spaced. But the times these troops were mobilized actually was higher. And so you often encounter actually tens and tens of occasions in which tens of thousands of men were mobilized by these coalition forces throughout the era. And they were actually used. Most of the time, it's not they were simply mobilized. Maybe they were mobilized, they did something, but we do not know. But the overwhelming majority of the times, they did something. Like it was mostly raiding the enemy districts, besieging a castle, and essentially luring the enemy out for a clash, and then that's how it proceeded. It's extremely difficult to study this period well for the aforementioned reasons. Like it is true that this period is not studied, that it is a phase of some sort of very strangely underrated and ignored, a strange period that nobody seems to appreciate in the way it should. We must enter a bit more into the details, but also in here I sometimes wonder how, because sometimes it's breaking the wall of literally of unawareness that I understand being there. There is nothing, unfortunately, can be simply done about it. it must be accepted to an extent, but also from there worked on, because how do you even address it otherwise? Like it's a moment of a reflection, if anything, also for, again, us as historians, is why haven't we talked about this? I have all the answers, of course, but at the end of the video I have to sound relatively humble, if anything, for thanking you for having arrived until here. That's the case, right? We always have to realize that there is a limit that intrinsically remains for our laziness, for our negligence, whatever. And just the period is so interesting. I don't know how often we'll come back on it. I, of course, have lots of different topics, especially for the specials. But these ones from the cycle to every once in a while, like, they must be really told, because they're important histories, they're relevant topics, and they can't simply be missed. If you're interested in Italian communal warfare in particular, of course I can do more about it. You can just ask me and I will provide, because I was noticing before, for the Battle of Montecatini, like, we don't even have this kind of like, we don't even have videos on this. And I'm starting to think one major topic on the Battle of Montecatini one major thing should be making a video on this, so that will be the only place on YouTube where this or anywhere else for that matter, this will be properly analyzed, right? So it's important, again, to cover this all. We must be alert, we have to balance everything equally. We have to cover a bit everything, but realize also that this content is central to medieval history. This content is the key without which you can't really open medieval warfare. If you don't study this topic, you can't quite study anything else. And it really, in the entire art of war, we didn't talk too much about why that was the case, because actually this video is not about the medieval Italian tactics, say, of the period. And I'm unsure whether, like, maybe you should make a special on that, because the cycle, I don't think, is going to produce any of this, sadly enough, because, again, it's not really a like the topic that you can't find elsewhere that easily, right? So everything must be very well calibrated on the basis of this. I'm about, say, not very soon, but I have to make the video about 13th century Florence, that in part will deal further with the historical background that we have observed today. There is properly it's a Florentine history, so it mostly talks about that, but of course Florence becomes so central in this that you have the say an important set of explanations for the entire system, because if you don't get the single history of the single city, of course it will remain blurred. Say, you see, one city did this, one city did that, but then you don't actually see what they were doing individually, like why we were doing this or that in their respective function. There is a history, and it's very difficult actually to reconstruct it. It's very difficult to simply to list this all and to make it like a comprehensive history of the individual story, right? So it's actually relevant to focus on those individual communal stories in order to to gain a bit more of like a general insight on the topic, and also some proper appreciation for the individual plays, for what brought these forces to be unleashed, to be fielded. Otherwise, you really don't come out of it alive, I would say. Now, well, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.